In the burning sands of Judea, a spark ignited into a fire that would challenge the greatest empire on earth. It was not the armies of Persia, nor the legions of Carthage, but a small, defiant people rising against Rome itself. From the holy streets of Jerusalem to the barren hills of Galilee, rebellion turned faith into fury. This was no ordinary war. It was a clash of gods, empires, and destinies. And in the flames, both Rome and Judea would be forever changed. Stay with us as we journey through fire and faith, uncovering the war that scarred Rome and shattered Judea. Witness the rise of heroes, the wrath of emperors, and the fall of a holy city. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic history. The year was AD 66. In the arid hills of Judea, beneath the relentless sun, a storm of fury gathered. What began as whispers of anger among the oppressed soon thundered into open defiance. Rome, the eternal empire, had ruled over Judea for nearly a century, binding it with chains of taxation, legions, and governors, who neither knew nor cared for the sacred traditions of the land. But for the people of Judea, faith was not merely custom, it was life itself. And when that faith was insulted, it became fire. The seeds of rebellion had long been sown. Roman procurators demanded crushing taxes, bleeding the farmers and craftsmen until they bent under the weight of debt. Wealth flowed eastward, feeding the empire, while famine and despair lingered in the villages of Judea. Worse still were the sacrilegious acts committed by governors who mocked Jewish rituals, seizing temple funds for imperial projects, and even daring to bring the imperial eagle into the holy city of Jerusalem. To the people, this was not just oppression, it was blasphemy. In marketplaces and synagogues, voices rose in anger. Zealots, fiery men consumed with faith, cried out that the time of patience had ended. No longer would Judea bow to pagan masters, nor watch their holy places defiled. They spoke of deliverance, of a God who had parted seas and struck down empires before. Why not Rome? Why not now? The breaking point came with blood. A minor dispute in Caesarea, the Roman provincial capital, ignited into slaughter. Greek and Jewish communities clashed in the streets, and when Roman troops failed to protect the Jews, or worse, sided with their enemies, the fury exploded. In Jerusalem itself, riots consumed the city. Zealots stormed the garrisons, overpowering stunned legionaries. The symbol of Roman rule, the fortress of Antonia near the Temple Mount, fell into rebel hands. For a moment it seemed as if the impossible had happened. The world's greatest empire was being driven from its holy city by common men armed with nothing but blades, stones, and unbreakable faith. But rebellion is rarely born of hope alone. It was tragedy that gave it breath. Thousands had suffered under Rome's taxes, its whips, its soldiers quartered in their homes. Families were torn apart by debt collectors, sons taken as slaves, daughters humiliated before foreign officials. Every insult, every lash of injustice was stored in silence, until silence broke. As Jerusalem blazed with revolt, the people looked to the heavens. Priests spoke a prophecy that the God of Israel would deliver his people once more, as in the days of Pharaoh. Yet others trembled, for they knew Rome's wrath was unlike any foe they had ever faced. To defy the empire was to invite annihilation. Still, the people of Judea could not turn back. In every village, men took up arms. Farmers abandoned their fields, shepherds their flocks to march in defense of their land and their God. Mothers and wives watched as their sons swore oaths of blood, binding themselves to fight until either freedom or death claimed them. The first Roman response came swiftly. Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, marched south with the 12th Legion and auxiliary cohorts, determined to stamp out the rebellion before it spread. But in the narrow passes near Beth Horon, the Jews struck with ferocious cunning. They ambushed the legions, cutting them to pieces, seizing standards, and sending survivors fleeing in panic. News of this disaster raced across the empire. Rome, the invincible Rome, had suffered humiliation at the hands of a provincial people it considered beneath notice. The world trembled, for if Judea could rise, what might stop Gaul, Egypt, or Spain from daring the same? And so the tragedy deepened. For the people of Judea, the rebellion was not merely a war against soldiers. It was a war of faith, destiny, and survival. For Rome, it became a test of pride and vengeance. The flames of war had been lit, and they would not be easily extinguished. Jerusalem, the holy city, was no longer just a place of worship. It was the beating heart of defiance. As the sun set over its walls, its people knew that the path they had chosen could end only in triumph or in ruin. In that moment, Judea had stepped into the jaws of history, and Rome prepared to bear its fangs. From the ashes of despair, heroes emerge. Not always kings, not always crowned in gold, but men who carry the weight of a people's hope upon their shoulders. In the Jewish Revolt, such men rose like sparks flaring into flame. Among them, one name would echo louder than the rest: Simon Bar Giora. Simon was no senator, no priest, no noble of Jerusalem. He was a man of the people, forged in hardship, born of the soil of Judea itself. Hardened by years of oppression, he knew the sting of Roman whips and the hunger of taxed fields. Yet what made him different was not merely anger, but vision. He saw not only the yoke of Rome, but the possibility of breaking it. He dreamed of Judea free, a nation reborn. At first, the rebellion was scattered, 100 factions, a dozen leaders, each burning with zeal but lacking unity. In Galilee, the young commander Josephus fought with strategy and cunning. In Jerusalem, the zealots, fierce and uncompromising, seized the temple and declared war upon Rome itself. But it was Simon Bar Giora who would take these embers and feed them into a firestorm. Simon was a warrior by instinct. He gathered followers from the countryside, peasants who had known nothing but toil and despair. To them he promised freedom and vengeance. Clad in armor stripped from Roman dead, wielding weapons forged in secret smithies, his band grew into an army. And unlike others, Simon welcomed the dispossessed, runaway slaves, debtors, even bandits. To Rome they were criminals. To Simon they were soldiers of liberation. As his ranks swelled, Simon's reputation spread. He did not hide in caves or strike in shadows. He marched openly, raiding Roman convoys, burning estates of collaborators, seizing grain stores to feed his followers. To many he became the living embodiment of resistance, the man who dared to strike at the empire with fearless defiance. Jerusalem, however, was divided. The holy city had become a fortress, but it was torn by factional strife. Zealots held the Temple Mount, suspicious of any rival claim to leadership. Priests and moderates urged caution, fearing the wrath of Rome would crush them all. Into this maelstrom Simon entered, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. By AD 69, Simon marched into Jerusalem at the head of 15,000 men, welcomed by the people who saw him as a savior. The zealots snarled, the priests recoiled, but the masses cheered. For Simon represented what others only whispered, the chance that Judea could not merely resist Rome, but defeat it. Inside the walls, Simon transformed Jerusalem into a war camp. The temple became an arsenal, its sacred courts echoing with the clang of forges. Every street was lined with barricades, every gate fortified, every tower manned. The city was no longer a sanctuary of faith alone. It was a fortress of rebellion, a beacon to all Judea that Rome could be challenged. But Simon's rise was not without shadow. He was fierce, uncompromising, and ruthless. To those who opposed him, whether Roman sympathizers or rival leaders, he showed no mercy. His men plundered the wealthy, seized supplies, and imposed discipline with iron fists. To some, he was a tyrant in the making. To others, he was the only hope of survival. In this contradiction lay the essence of Simon, both liberator and despot, both hero and destroyer. Yet the people followed. In their songs and whispers, they spoke of Simon as a new Judas Maccabeus, the warrior who would cleanse the land of oppressors just as the Maccabees had driven out the Seleucids generations before. Mothers pointed to him as they told their sons that freedom was worth fighting for. Fathers sharpened swords and marched to his banner, believing that under Simon's hand, Judea could endure. As the year of civil war raged across the empire, the year of the 4 emperors, Rome was distracted, bleeding itself in the streets of its own capital. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, emperors rose and fell like leaves in a storm. To the rebels in Judea, this was a sign from heaven. Rome was vulnerable, its gods had abandoned it. And in the pause of Roman fury, Simon's power only grew. But fate is cruel, for even as Simon stood tall in Jerusalem, his enemies multiplied. Rival factions, jealous of his command, fought among themselves. John of Gischala, another rebel leader, clashed with Simon for dominance. The city that should have stood united against Rome dissolved into civil war within its own walls. Blood was spilled not only by legionaries, but by Judean upon Judean, as factions slaughtered each other in the name of freedom. Still, Simon endured. When Vespasian, and later his son Titus, marched upon Judea with the might of the empire, they did not face scattered bands of rebels. They faced a city bristling with walls, towers, and men whose faith turned fear into fury. And at the heart of that city stood Simon Bar Giora, the peasant-turned-general, the man who would fight Rome to the last breath. In him, Judea found its hero, not perfect, not gentle, but fierce enough to stand before the storm. His rise was not of crown or throne, but of fire and defiance. And as the legions gathered beyond the horizon, all eyes turned to Jerusalem and the man who had sworn never to bow. For Simon Bar Giora, the struggle was not merely for land, nor even for survival. It was for the soul of his people. And in the crucible of war, he would carve his name into history, whether in triumph or in ashes. For centuries, Rome had stood unshaken. The legions marched from Britannia to Parthia, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania, binding the world in roads and laws, in blood and fear. Cities burned, kings bowed, nations bent. Yet in the year AD 66, a small province in the eastern corner of the empire dared to rise, and what should have been a minor revolt grew into a wound that festered across the empire. Rome was no stranger to rebellion. Gauls had risen, Britons had fought, Germans had defied. But Judea was different. It was not merely a land. It was a crucible of faith, a city that claimed to house the dwelling place of a single jealous God. To defeat the Jews was not simply to win a war, it was to challenge belief itself. And Rome, with its pantheon of gods and cult of emperors, could not tolerate a people who defied its divine authority. The first shock came with the humiliation of Cestius Gallus. His 12th legion had been torn apart in the passes of Beth Horon, its standards captured, its men slaughtered. In Rome, the Senate heard the news in disbelief. The legions, pride of the empire, had been disgraced by provincials armed with little more than faith and fury. Murmurs spread. If Judea could defeat Rome, what might others dare? But Rome had no time to act swiftly, for in AD 68, chaos erupted at the empire's very heart. Nero, the emperor who had ruled with extravagance and cruelty, was declared a public enemy. Hunted by his own senate, abandoned by his guards, Nero ended his life with a dagger's thrust, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." With his death, the empire fell into an abyss. What followed was a nightmare, the year of the 4 emperors. Galba marched on Rome, only to be cut down by Otho. Otho, in turn, fell to Vitellius, whose gluttony and weakness disgraced the purple. Civil war raged across Italy, legions slaughtering legions. Cities torn apart not by foreign foes, but by their own defenders. The empire quaked as generals declared themselves emperors, and the Rhine and Danube frontiers grew restless. For the rebels in Judea, it seemed divine providence. Rome was distracted, devouring itself. The legions that should have descended upon Jerusalem were instead spilling blood on Roman soil. To many Jews, this was the sign they had prayed for. The empire was mortal, vulnerable, and their God had chosen this moment for deliverance. But to Rome, humiliation bred fury, and amid the chaos, one man rose above the storm, Vespasian. From his camp in Judea, commanding legions hardened by years of conquest, he saw the empire unraveling. While others clawed for power in Rome, Vespasian bided his time, securing the east, forging alliances, waiting for the moment to strike. Still, the revolt in Judea could not be ignored. Reports of rebel victories, of Roman garrisons slaughtered, of Jerusalem turned into a fortress, poured into Rome. Senators feared that if Judea remained free, it would inspire others to rise. Rome's image as eternal, invincible, would crack. An empire built on fear could not afford such a fracture. Thus, Judea became more than a provincial rebellion. It became a test of Rome's very identity. Could the empire survive its civil wars, its decadent emperors, and still impose its will on the world? Or would the rebellion in Jerusalem mark the beginning of Rome's decline? The tremors were felt everywhere. Merchants complained of disrupted trade routes, as caravans that once flowed from Arabia to the Mediterranean now faced raids by rebels. The temple in Jerusalem, once a marvel of wealth, no longer sent tribute to Rome, starving the empire of revenue. Even Rome's allies in the east, client kings and provinces, watched with unease. If the legions failed again, loyalty might wither, and the empire's eastern provinces could crumble. Meanwhile, in Judea, the rebellion grew in confidence. Coins were minted bearing Hebrew inscriptions, an open declaration that Rome's authority no longer held sway. Every such coin was a dagger at the heart of imperial prestige, proclaiming to the world, Judea was free, Judea was sovereign, Judea defied Rome. And within Rome itself, fear whispered. Senators, jaded by Nero's madness and the civil wars that followed, wondered if the empire had overreached. Could a single city, holy to one god, bring the empire to its knees? Could an empire stretched across continents collapse under the weight of its own arrogance? When Vespasian finally declared himself emperor in AD 69, backed by the Eastern legions, stability began to return. Yet his throne was not secure until Rome's enemies were crushed, and chief among those enemies stood Judea. The empire, scarred by civil war, turned its full gaze eastward. No longer could Judea be tolerated as a rebellious province. It had to be made an example. Its cities had to burn, its people subdued, its temple razed if necessary. For Rome to live, Judea must die. Thus, the tragedy deepened on both sides. In Jerusalem, zeal and faith welded factions together and tore them apart, as men like Simon Bar Giora promised salvation through war. In Rome, emperors rose and fell, but the machine of empire ground ever forward, its legions gathering like a thundercloud on the horizon. The empire trembled, yes, but in trembling it grew dangerous. Rome had been humiliated, weakened, mocked, and Rome would not rest until its wrath fell upon Jerusalem with a fury unlike any the world had ever seen. For the Jews, this was a holy war. For Rome, it was survival. And survival for Rome meant annihilation. When empires tremble, titans emerge. For Rome, racked by civil war and shame, salvation came not from senators in marble halls, but from soldiers hardened in dust and blood. Among them, two names would carve themselves into the stone of history, Vespasian and Titus. Father and son, generals of the East, destined not only to crush a rebellion, but to reshape the destiny of Rome itself. Vespasian was no patrician prince. Born of equestrian rank, he rose through discipline and endurance, not luxury. He had marched in Germania, fought in Britain, endured the mud, the cold, the endless grind of campaigns that broke lesser men. His eyes were steady, his temper practical, his patience vast. Rome needed such a man, for the chaos of Nero's court had nearly undone the empire. Vespasian brought order where others sowed madness. When Nero unleashed war upon Judea in AD 66, it was Vespasian who was chosen to lead the Eastern legions. With him marched the 5th and 10th legions, later joined by the 15th. Veterans scarred from Parthian wars, engineers who could build siege ramps like mountains, cavalry that could shatter rebel lines with thunderous charges. This was no punitive expedition. It was a storm forged to crush. By his side rode Titus, his son. Where Vespasian was seasoned and steady, Titus was youthful, ambitious, and charismatic. Tall, commanding, gifted with both charm and cruelty, he carried not only the sword of Rome, but the future of his house. For Vespasian knew that Judea was not only a war, it was the stage upon which his family might ascend to imperial power. Together, father and son began their campaign. They moved methodically, like surgeons cutting into flesh. Galilee, stronghold of Josephus, was the first to fall. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the legions advanced. At Judea, the Romans encircled the defenders with earthworks and towers. For 47 days, the Jews resisted, hurling stones, boiling oil, and fiery darts. But Roman discipline was relentless. Siege towers rolled forward, rams battered walls, tunnels undermined foundations. When the city fell, blood washed its streets. 40,000 were slaughtered. Josephus himself was captured, spared only because he prophesied that Vespasian would one day be emperor. This prophecy echoed like thunder. Soldiers whispered it in camps. Officers murmured it in strategy tents. Perhaps, they thought, the gods had chosen this man for greater things. And indeed, as Rome tore itself apart in civil war, Vespasian's destiny drew nearer. Yet for now, his gaze remained fixed on Judea. His method was deliberate. Do not strike Jerusalem first, but bleed the province dry. One by one, strongholds fell. Joppa, Tarichaea, Gamala. Each became a monument to Roman ruthlessness. Survivors were crucified in rows so vast that forests were stripped bare to provide wood. The message was clear. Resistance would mean extinction. And still, Jerusalem held. By AD 69, as Vespasian's legions tightened the noose, Rome itself collapsed into chaos. Nero dead, Galba slain, Otho fallen, Vitellius gluttonous and doomed. In the east, Vespasian saw his moment. His troops hailed him emperor. With Egypt, Syria, and Judea under his command, he marched not to Jerusalem, but to Rome itself. Leaving Titus behind to continue the siege, he crossed into Italy, crushed Vitellius's forces, and claimed the purple. The prophecy had come true. The general of Judea had become emperor, and now the war was no longer a campaign of necessity. It was the crucible in which the Flavian dynasty would be forged. For Titus, this was both burden and opportunity. At only 30, he was entrusted with the task of ending the Jewish war. He knew failure was impossible. Victory would not only avenge Rome, but crown his father's reign with legitimacy. Defeat would shame the new dynasty before it even began. Thus Titus bore down upon Jerusalem with merciless precision. He studied its walls, 3 concentric rings of stone, rising with towers and gates. He counted its defenders, riven by factions that warred among themselves even as Rome approached. He understood the city was both fortress and trap, sacred and doomed. To take it would require patience and brutality in equal measure. The legions encamped around Jerusalem like a steel ring. Siege engines groaned. Catapults hurled stones that shattered houses and temples. Ballistae launched iron bolts that tore men apart. Roman soldiers dug trenches, raised earthworks, cut down trees for rams and towers. The ground shook with the march of thousands. The clash of hammers, the rumble of war machines, and yet the defenders fought with a fury Rome had rarely seen. They sallied forth, burning siege towers, ambushing patrols, hurling missiles from the walls. Inside, men like Simon Bar Giora swore oaths that Jerusalem would never fall. Women urged their sons to die as martyrs rather than live as slaves. Priests proclaimed that God himself would intervene, as he had against Pharaoh, as he had against Babylon. But Titus was relentless. He tightened the siege not by storming recklessly, but by starving the city. Grain fields outside were destroyed, wells poisoned, supply lines severed. Famine crept into the holy city like a silent conqueror. Bread grew scarce, then vanished. Children cried in hunger, mothers wasted away, fathers sold their lives in desperate sorties against the Roman lines. As famine gnawed, Titus watched, calculating. Every day the defenders weakened. Every day his legions grew stronger. To him, victory was not a matter of if, but when. Still, the cost was immense. Thousands of Jews perished outside the walls, crucified within sight of their kin. Roman soldiers, hardened yet unsettled, spoke of the strange resilience of this people, who fought not merely for land, but for their God. Even among Rome's veterans, admiration mingled with hatred. In Titus, Judea had found its nemesis. He was no Nero, decadent and distracted, but a commander who blended Roman discipline with personal ambition. To destroy Jerusalem was to secure his father's throne, to etch his own name into eternity, and he would not stop until the city burned. Thus the stage was set. On one side, Simon Bar Giora, the defiant hero of the people, standing within the holy walls. On the other, Titus, heir of a new dynasty, wielding the wrath of Rome. Both young, both fierce, both driven by visions of destiny. The war was no longer a mere rebellion. It was a duel between two wills, the faith of a nation and the iron of an empire. And in this duel, there could be no peace, only ruin. The year was AD 70, and the world's gaze fixed upon a single city. Jerusalem, sacred, defiant, burning with faith, stood ringed by the steel of Rome. At its gates camped Titus, son of Vespasian, heir to the Flavian dynasty, commander of the Eastern legions. He was no longer merely a general waging a campaign. He was the hand of Rome itself, entrusted with restoring an empire's broken pride. Rome had suffered humiliation. Rebellions had spread like sparks. Civil war had stained its streets with Roman blood. The Judean Revolt, once a provincial uprising, had become a festering wound that mocked Rome's invincibility. For Titus, there could be no compromise. Jerusalem must fall, not in negotiation or surrender, but in devastation so complete that no other province would dare imagine defiance. Yet Titus understood that brute force alone could not win this war. The walls of Jerusalem were massive, rising in 3 layers, each higher and stronger than the last. Siege engines battered them daily, but defenders rebuilt, sallied forth, and harassed the legions with tireless zeal. To storm recklessly was to waste lives and risk defeat. Instead, Titus chose a slower, more terrible weapon: patience. He ordered a wall of circumvallation to be built, nearly 5 miles long, encircling the city with ramparts, towers, and trenches. No one would enter, no one would leave. Jerusalem, once bustling with pilgrims and traders, was transformed into a cage. Inside, famine began its grim work. Grain stores dwindled and hunger stalked the streets. Mothers searched for crumbs, fathers gambled with death in daring raids for food. Disease followed hunger, spreading through cramped quarters. Corpses lay unburied in alleys, the stench choking the air. The temple, once a beacon of glory, now echoed with the wails of the starving. And still, the factions inside the city tore at each other. Simon Bar Giora and John of Gischala clashed for control, turning their blades not only against Rome, but against fellow Jews. While Rome built siege towers, the defenders burned each other's grain. While Titus tightened the noose, Jerusalem devoured itself. To the Romans watching from their camps, it seemed the city was committing its own suicide. To Titus, it was providence. But patience carried its own dangers. The longer the siege dragged on, the more restless the legions grew. Veterans yearned for plunder, officers pressed for decisive assault. Titus walked a narrow path between haste and discipline, between the desire for swift conquest and the necessity of inevitable victory. He inspired his men not with lavish promises, but with stern resolve. This war is not for riches, he reminded them, but for Rome's honor. And Rome's honor must be absolute. As months wore on, breaches were forced in the outer walls. Legionaries surged forward, only to find another wall rising behind. Each victory was bitter, each advance costly. The defenders fought like men possessed, hurling missiles, pouring boiling oil, rushing in suicidal charges. For them, this was not a battle of land, but of destiny. At last, the Romans reached the heart of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. Its white stones gleamed under the sun, a sanctuary revered not only by Jews but marveled at across the empire. Titus, standing before its grandeur, hesitated. Though ruthless, he understood the value of symbols. To destroy the temple was to annihilate the very soul of a people. Perhaps, he thought, mercy could preserve both Rome's victory and the city's sanctity. But war has a will of its own. Amid the chaos of battle, a Roman soldier hurled a torch. Flames leapt from chamber to chamber, devouring cedar beams, climbing golden walls. Priests screamed, defenders wailed, women beat their breasts. Titus shouted for the fire to be extinguished, but the inferno roared beyond command. The temple, the dwelling place of God, the heart of Judea, was consumed. Smoke rose like a funeral pyre into the heavens. To the Jews, it was the end of the world. To the Romans, it was vindication. Rome had not only conquered a city, it had destroyed a nation's very soul. Yet victory brought no joy. Titus walked among the ruins, his face grim, his heart torn between triumph and unease. He had won glory beyond measure, yet he knew this glory was bought with devastation. Tens of thousands lay dead, crucified or slaughtered. Survivors shuffled in chains, destined for slavery or the gladiatorial arenas. Jerusalem itself, once holy, lay in ashes. For Rome, however, this was rebirth. The Flavian dynasty, still fragile, needed legitimacy. Titus's victory provided it. Across the empire, coins were struck bearing the legend Judea capta, Judea captured, with images of weeping women beneath Roman eagles. Triumphs were celebrated in Rome, where captives marched in chains and the treasures of the temple, including the great golden menorah, dazzled the crowds. The Colosseum itself would be built in part from the spoils of Jerusalem's fall. The message was clear. Rome had risen from chaos. Its new emperors were not decadent Nero or gluttonous Vitellius, but warriors who had proven themselves in blood. The Judean War became the symbol of Flavian power, the crucible in which the empire's new age was forged. Titus himself returned to Rome not only as victor, but as hero. Senators hailed him, citizens cheered, poets sang of his conquest. He was young, handsome, and victorious, a living embodiment of Rome's renewal. The shame of Beth Horon was erased, replaced by the triumphal arches that would forever proclaim Rome's supremacy. And yet, the victory carried a shadow. For Judea, the wound would never heal. The temple destroyed, its people scattered, its holy city razed. These scars ran deeper than conquest. Even in chains, the Jewish spirit endured, whispering of loss and longing, of a homeland torn away but never forgotten. Rome had won, but in winning, it had forged an eternal memory of defiance. For Titus, the siege of Jerusalem was more than a campaign. It was the stage upon which he proved himself worthy of empire, the forge in which Rome's honor was reforged. He had led not by reckless fury but by relentless patience, wielding famine as surely as the sword, breaking a city not only by force but by despair. Thus the world looked upon him as the man who had resurrected Rome's glory. Yet history, ever cruel, remembers also the smoke rising from Jerusalem, the cries of the dying, the silence of a temple that would never rise again. In victory, Titus had secured Rome's rebirth, but he had also etched into eternity the price of empire. The siege had dragged into its final, merciless stage. By late summer of AD 70, Jerusalem was no longer a city. It was a corpse waiting to be buried. Its walls, once proud ramparts of defiance, lay shattered in heaps of stone. Its people, once a multitude of pilgrims and merchants, now staggered as emaciated shadows, consumed by hunger, disease, and despair. Yet even in the face of doom, the defenders clung to their faith and their cause. To surrender was unthinkable. To yield the holy city, the dwelling place of their God, was to betray their ancestors and their children alike. And so they fought, not with hope of victory, but with the stubborn resolve that if they must die, they would die free. The Romans, hardened by years of campaigning, pressed forward with unyielding force. They stormed the upper city, advancing house by house, street by street. Flames devoured entire quarters as legionaries torched buildings, driving defenders from hiding places. The clash of iron on stone echoed through alleys, mingled with the shrieks of women and the desperate cries of children. And at the center of it all loomed the Temple Mount. Though already scarred by fire, its great court still swarmed with survivors clinging to their sanctuary. There, priests raised final prayers, their voices drowned by the thunder of Roman rams and the crackle of burning roofs. The defenders hurled stones from above, arrows whistled from the towers, and for a moment it seemed their spirit would not be extinguished. But the end was inevitable. The walls collapsed and the Romans poured in. The temple, already aflame, collapsed into a sea of fire. Its golden ornaments melted in rivers of molten metal. Its cedar beams roared in pillars of flame. The sacred menorah, seized by Roman hands, would be carried to Rome as a trophy of divine conquest. The Ark of the Covenant, if still hidden within, vanished into the abyss of legend. The destruction was not merely military, it was symbolic. The holiest place of the Jewish people, the heart of their faith and their nationhood, was erased from the earth. Smoke rose into the sky in black clouds, blotting out the sun, visible for miles around. For the defenders, it was not only the loss of a city, but the death of a world. Titus, standing amid the ruins, beheld both triumph and tragedy. His soldiers clamored for slaughter, and slaughter they delivered. Tens of thousands were cut down, their blood staining the stones. Others were crucified in grotesque rows outside the walls, a forest of suffering that testified to Rome's merciless justice. Survivors were shackled in chains, destined for slavery across the empire. And yet, amid the carnage, Titus felt the gravity of what had been done. He had destroyed not just a city, but a civilization's heart. The temple's smoke would linger in history as long as memory endured. Still, he could not afford hesitation. Rome demanded spectacle. Rome demanded vengeance. Rome demanded renewal. And through this devastation, Rome would be reborn. When Titus returned to the Eternal City, the triumph was unlike any before. He marched through the streets, leading his legions while captives trudged behind in chains. Treasures from the temple dazzled the crowds, the golden table, the silver trumpets, the seven-branched menorah gleaming under the Italian sun. Senators cheered, citizens wept with awe, and the Flavian dynasty was secured. The Arch of Titus, raised in his honor, immortalized the moment. Carved in stone, Romans would forever see their soldiers carrying the spoils of Jerusalem, the menorah borne aloft as the ultimate symbol of victory. The Colosseum itself, monument of Rome's grandeur, rose in part from the spoils of the Jewish war. From ruin, Rome had forged renewal. From conquest, it had carved immortality. But for Judea, the story was one of loss that no victory parade could erase. Its people were scattered to the winds, exiled from their holy city, bound in chains, or driven into diaspora. Without the temple, worship itself was transformed. Faith became survival. Memory became resistance. Though Rome had won, it had planted seeds of eternal grief and of eternal resilience. This was the paradox of empire. In its greatest triumph, it sowed the roots of future defiance. Rome stood taller, prouder, its name thundered across the known world. But in Jerusalem's ashes lay a memory too fierce to die, a story too powerful to be silenced. Thus ended the great Jewish revolt, not with reconciliation, but with fire and chains. For Rome, it was the climax of vengeance and the dawn of renewal. For Judea, it was a wound that would bleed through centuries, carried in prayers whispered across the earth. The smoke of Jerusalem may have faded from the skies, but it never faded from history. Rome had rebirthed its empire in blood and flame. Yet in doing so, it etched into eternity the price of its supremacy, a price measured not in gold or territory, but in the indelible scars of a people who would never forget. And so the story closes. Jerusalem in ruins, Rome in glory, the world forever changed. Out of destruction came rebirth, and from the ashes of one nation rose the towering supremacy of another. This was not merely war, it was destiny written in fire.